everyone, and welcome. Now, I want you to forget everything you think you know about history for a second. Forget the kings, the queens, all the epic battles. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and travel 1,000 years into the past to see what daily life was really like for most people. So, this is the big question for today. If you strip away all those grand stories, what did it actually mean to wake up, go to work, and raise a family at the turn of the first millennium? What were people's hopes, their fears, their day-to-day reality? To figure that out, we really need to look at two very, very different worlds that grew out of the ashes of the Roman Empire.
So, on one hand, you've got the Byzantine Empire in the east. Think urban, sophisticated, and they saw themselves as the direct heirs to Rome. But then you look to the west, and it's a completely different picture. It's rural, it's fragmented, full of new kingdoms just trying to find their footing. Two worlds, both spinning out of the same Roman legacy.
First things first, let's talk about the social ladder. Because back then, more than anything else, your station in life decided everything. Literally from the kind of justice you could expect to the food you put on your table. Over in the Byzantine Empire, society was pretty much split right down the middle into two groups. You had the honest Eurius, the privileged, your wealthy, powerful elites, and then you had the humiliorious, the humble, which was, basically everybody else. And this wasn't just a social thing. It was baked into the law, and it could have life or death consequences. And the contrast between the two regions is just wow. In Byzantium, your class literally determined your punishment. A rich guy might pay a fine for a crime that a poor guy would get flogged or even mutilated for. But there was a way up. If you were smart, you could get an education and a job in the massive state bureaucracy. Now, you hop over to Western Europe, and it's a whole different ballgame. It was all about land and loyalty. A warrior aristocracy was at the top, and feudal ties held the whole thing together. For most folks, your entire life was tied to the land you worked, with almost zero chance of ever leaving. Okay, so that's the public world, but what about life behind closed doors? Let's dive into the private sphere and talk about family, gender, and what home was like. So the official view of women in Western Europe, which was heavily shaped by the church, could be incredibly harsh. I mean, just read this quote. It paints women as the source of all sin. It's a pretty bleak starting point, to say the least. But, and this is a huge but, that is not the whole story. Not by a long shot. The official line from on high is one thing, the reality on the ground every day was something else entirely. And this is where it gets really interesting, because despite that official view, women in Western Europe actually had these surprising areas of power. For instance, they kept the rights to property they brought into a marriage. In pretty much any household, from a peasant's to a noble's, women were often the ones managing the entire domestic economy. And ironically, the church itself offered a path to freedom. A woman could choose to become a nun, even if her family didn't want her to. And some noblewomen became incredibly powerful political figures as abbesses, running huge estates and wielding real influence. Now, if we look at marriage, there are some really interesting differences. In Byzantium, the marriage age was, shockingly young by our standards, and getting a divorce was next to impossible. But that rigidity also meant a widow could inherit her husband's property and become the powerful head of her own family. Over in the West, marriage for the nobility was all about politics. It was a tool for making alliances, and legally, a woman was always under her husband's authority. Nowhere was the gap between the rich and poor more obvious than in their homes. A wealthy Byzantine family might be living it up in a huge house with a courtyard, private baths, beautiful mosaics, the whole 9 yards. Most people, though, they lived in simple, crowded homes, either crammed into city apartment blocks called insulae or in little mud brick houses out in a village. Okay, so you've got a place to live. Now what do you do all day? Let's get into the daily grind and see what people actually did for a living.
Because the Byzantine Empire was so urban, there was a much wider variety of jobs. You had your educated professionals, the lawyers, the accountants, the guys who kept the whole state running. You had merchants and bankers who were often really rich but kind of looked down on by the old money aristocrats. Craftsmen were all organized into these powerful guilds. And then, of course, you had farmers, and at the very bottom, these agricultural laborers called coloni. Now, they were technically free, but they were tied to the land they worked, which made their lives just barely better than a slave's.
And to really put this into perspective, let's look at some actual numbers from a few centuries earlier. An unskilled laborer might make 25 denarii for a day's work. A baker, who's a skilled craftsman, made double that, 50. But a painter, an artist, could pull in 150 denarii. That just shows you the economic hierarchy in black and white. It's clear that even way back then, having a specialized skill was worth a lot of money.
All right, all that work is going to make you hungry. So what was actually on the menu 1,000 years ago? Well, like everything else we've talked about, it completely depended on who you were.
I mean, just look at this chart. It tells you everything. If you were a peasant, about 80% of your diet was grain. And we're talking the cheap stuff like barley and oats, probably in a porridge or a dense bread. Now, for a noble, grain was still a big deal, but it was the good stuff, fine wheat. And check out that second bar. A full quarter of their diet was meat and fish, food the poor would be lucky to see once a month.
So what does all that grain add up to, calorie-wise? Well, it's estimated that an adult peasant man doing back-breaking farm labor all day was taking in about 2,900 calories. Seems about right, doesn't it? Well, hold that thought and compare it to the elite.
An aristocrat? They might be putting away up to 5,000 calories a day. That is a massive surplus, and it reflects a diet that was just loaded with meat, fish, and booze. But wait, it gets even more surprising. Because the biggest eaters of all? Monks. Yeah, monks. On a normal day, their intake could hit a staggering 6,000 calories. This actually led to widespread obesity and all the health problems that come with it, like arthritis. A far cry from the simple life they were supposed to be living.
But life wasn't all just hard work and prayer, right? People needed to unwind. So what did they actually do for fun?
Just try to imagine walking down a main street in a big city like Constantinople. It would have been a total assault on the senses. You've got jugglers and acrobats trying to earn a few coins, food vendors shouting about what they're selling, fortune tellers offering to show you the future, and holy men preaching to anyone who'll listen. Entertainment was literally everywhere. And there were special places for it, too. The most famous was the Hippodrome, home of the absolutely thrilling and often deadly chariot races. But you also had busy markets and fairs, which were as much about hanging out as they were about shopping. Theaters were used for public meetings and shows, and the public baths, well, they were a huge part of social life, kind of like their version of a coffee shop or a community center, a place to just relax and catch up. So there you have it, a little glimpse into two totally different worlds, both coexisting 1,000 years ago. One was the bureaucratic, urban, sophisticated heir to Rome. The other was the rural, fragmented warrior society that would eventually grow into modern Europe. And it kind of leaves us with one last thought. Of these two very distinct paths, which one really had the bigger impact on the world that you and I live in today? It's a heck of a question to think about. Thanks for joining me on this trip back in time.